Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of our workshop. We wanted to have this session today to offer some support in the research process to anybody who is doing research, students, undergraduate students, postgraduate students, because we think it is something that is important. And these are some of the areas that from time to time we'll hear students say they need some form of assistance with. So we are hoping that this will be a useful session today. Now, we have three presenters from names on the screen. I am Byron. We have Dr. Sabrina Chinian, and we have Dr. Kiara Matthews. We have three presentations for you today, and towards the end of the session, we are hoping to give you the floor to possibly pick our brains and have some discussion around what we discussed or what we presented here today. So we aren't going to wait any longer. We'll start with Dr. Kiara Matthews with her presentation.
Thank you, Byron. Good morning, everyone. So this morning, I will be presenting to you about how to get started on your research proposals in terms of your introduction and everything that should be involved in there. One second. Lovely. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's important, right? Duh. Like, you need to have the introduction. Where are you going to start? You need to introduce what you need to do. So we will look at what is an introduction, what needs to be in your background of the study, your justification of the research topic, your problem or thesis statement, and then we'll take some questions. If not at the end of my presentation, at the very end of all of our presentations today. So what is an introduction? And as I have laid out here, your introduction outline provides the roadmap of your thoughts from the current landscape of whatever you're researching to the specific research question or questions. It is the tool through which you discern if your inquiry even makes sense and truly addresses what you think it does. So it's an opportunity to poke holes in the assumptions that you may have made, and that usually leads to the type of research question that you have. And then it identifies leaps in the thoughts that are either unfounded or lacking support or clarity. It can be one of the most difficult things to write, like where do you even start, right? And then it forces you to create those milestones that us as creatives, we're in the humanities, that we might just skip. So in your introduction, these are the things that you could or should have. So for the background of this study, there are three things you want to focus on. These three things, okay. You want to set the stage for the inquiry or exploration. You want to define the current state, and then you want to define the problem. So in setting the stage for your inquiry or exploration, the first thing you want to do is identify what is the landscape of the issue. So what is the incidence? What is the number of people impacted? Who does it affect? Is it working professionals? Is it teachers? Are they linguists? Are they people in France? People in Latin America? Who falls within that scope, right? Then you want to briefly give an outline of what is the problem. We don't know this. We don't know if we can apply this. We don't know how to do. There's an issue somewhere. And your study has to now come and answer the questions related to that problem, right? In defining the current state, you now want to look at how is this situation currently managed, addressed, approached, treated with, taught, written about, however you want to look at that, right? So right now, this group does X. This author does X. We use this form of language. We don't use this form of language. Those types of things. And what do we currently know? We know that, the sky is blue in the day and it's not as blue in the night, those very straightforward things. What do we know for a fact? Very concrete things you want to be able to identify. And then in defining the problem, why is the current state an issue? Why do we even need to research this in the first place? What is missing? What don't we know? So all those things go into the background of how you even present the issue or the problem or the exploration of your study. Next, you have to justify the research. You could say, this is so important, but does it even matter? So you want to know, why is your study important? Other people's studies have been important, but why is yours important? How does it impact academia? Does it even impact academia? How does it impact the world? And the world might not necessarily be all of Earth. It might be Trinidad, Tobago, the Caribbean, Latin America, French-speaking countries. How does it impact the community outside of you, the researcher? Is your study even relevant? Does it answer a practical or valuable problem? Does it solve a problem? Does it just give more insight to the problem? How does it build upon and does it improve any existing research that's already out there? Right? Why should the rest of us care? Because you might think this is so important, and then someone reading your proposal might go, okay, that's cute, who would benefit from the information that you are researching, that the information that you will present? So some of these questions might feel unanswerable, right? You might be looking at these questions and going, I don't know. And just because you can't answer all of the questions, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do this study. Some of the questions should be answered. So first of all, why is your study important? You need to answer that one. Is your study relevant? You need to answer that one. But maybe your study does not solve a problem. Maybe it is to highlight a problem that people don't realize exists, right? And sometimes it's reverse engineered. So after you think you're finished with your introduction and you move on to your lit review or your methodology, you might go, oh wait, and then it answers a question that you may have looked over before. For example, in the realm of speech pathology, and my SLP students here will hear me talk about this a lot. We have a procedure called prompt. Prompt is effective, right? Prompt works, but the theoretical underpinnings for prompt sucks. It's so bad. It is so bad. When you look at the research that supports prompt, no, you don't want to do that. But somehow any clinician who is doing prompt will tell you it works. But why is it working? Is it one of those internal reliability things where it says it's treating something, but it's actually treating something else and it's manifesting this way? So then now we have researchers going back. They're working backwards. Why is this working if the research that was presented sucks, right? So this is how they are justifying their research. So they are now trying to reverse engineer the research that already existed for something that seems to be effective. So there are different ways you can justify your research topic, right? So moving on to your problem or thesis statement, it depends on the type of research that you're doing. You might use different names. But you want to look at the scope of your study. We kind of already spoke about the relevance of your study. You want to look at the research question or questions. And then depending on the type of study you're doing, you might present a hypothesis or not. The scope. What specific problem, what specific area of study, what specific population is being affected here? Is it children with autism? Is it teachers of English as a second language? You know, what is who? The very specific details of the people and the things being affected by your study. What is the context? So are you looking at what happened during COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID, online teaching, in-person teaching? Are you looking at the direct consequences of the thing? Or are you looking at indirect, as in the perceptions around what the main topic is? Then what are the research gaps, right? So in the relevance, you want to just think back, who cares? Who is going to benefit from this information? So you might say something earlier on and then double back. You might find yourself being redundant, but again, in your editing and your rereading, you're going to be able to narrow it down and be a little more streamlined in your writing. When it comes to the research question, you want to think of the type of research you're doing. And I believe Dr. Chinian is going to go into that a little bit. Are you doing purely theoretical? Is it purely empirical? Is it basic? Basic doesn't quite fall so much in our realm. That's more like math and physics, where this is gravity. And kind of present what it is. And then, or applied research. We're looking at how this thing affects this thing specifically. And that would inform the type of research question that you do. Another thing for your research questions that you want to consider is, what would make your research question a good, great, stellar, outstanding, fantastic research question? So you want to think of a question that hasn't been answered before. So even if someone did the study, their study wasn't good and you are going to make their study look better, or a question that has not been asked at all. Like nobody ever thought of this thing ever, and you are the first to do it. Next, you want to look at, is your question something that is going to give you insight on the research subjects or the research objects? So are you focusing on the people affected, or are you focusing on the thing? I will speak from the realm of speech pathology. If we're looking at a particular intervention approach, are we looking at how the people respond to the approach, or are we looking at the efficacy of the approach itself, right? The other thing you want to keep in mind, are you just doing this because you want that field of research to become more robust? In Trinidad and Tobago, we have this amount of research in speech therapy. We will take anything. Just ask a question. We are happy for the information. Are you trying to fill a void that exists? So somebody may have asked it in the US or the UK. Nobody has ever asked it here in Trinidad or in the Caribbean, right? Do you know what are the current research interests in your field or in that area of study? Again, biased because I can speak about speech pathology. If I see one more study about the efficacy of non-speech motor movements, I'm going to grow more gray hair. We have studied that to the ends of the earth. It's not effective, by the way. The ends of the earth. we don't need any more research in that. We can research it some more, we could, but we don't need any more, right? And then, are you looking for something that can be applied? No offense to my colleagues here, but in the speech therapy world, our PhDs go, look at this thing. And I have a clinical doctorate. So then we go, okay, can we use it? And they say, no. Then what are you doing? What are you doing? That's not helping me. I need to know if I can use it to help the people that we are supposed to serve. No, that's just me. Sometimes it's just good to have the knowledge and, they are filling that void. But then I go, I can't do anything with that information. So is that the type of research question that you want to look at? You want to see how it can be applied, how it works, how it affects the community, it affects individual people, individual groups, that kind of thing, right? But you also need to be very specific with your wording. Here's a problem statement. I didn't have breakfast this morning. Am I asking? So the research question could be, why didn't Kiara have breakfast this morning? Does Kiara even like breakfast? How can Kiara convince her husband or her children to make breakfast for her? But same problem, but different questions can be derived from that problem. So you have to know what specific thing you're looking at. Calling out my students again. They have an assignment due today. And they had a lit review to do, and they had to come up with some research questions. And like, Kiara, I'm really struggling with these questions. And they give me some options, and I go, you're asking me the same thing, right? Just different words. It's the same thing. Like, yep. It's like, oh, well, I don't know what to ask. Like, okay, what would you like to know? I want to know X, Y, Z. That's your research question. Really? Yes. Not just that. Put a question mark at the end. Sometimes it's a lot more simple than you might think. But don't get caught up in the language up front. You might want to have the perfectly worded everything, and then you get into the lit review or the methodology and you realize, okay, you either shot yourself in the foot or you gave yourself too much work. Then you can work backward and adjust that question, right? Finally, with the hypothesis, this is really coming from, and those of you who include it, not everybody includes it, a place of curiosity and intuition. When you write a hypothesis, you're really making an educated guess based on the scientific or academic or theoretical prejudices that might already exist that you may know or have. And then the evidence that's out there, which you either further prove or disprove based on the type of study that you conduct. My thesis, I was looking at the efficacy of a particular clinical curriculum. And from my generic reading, I'm like, oh yeah, this works. And then the morning of my defense, I go, oh my God, I don't know. I don't know. It is possible to prove, disprove, or have no answer to your hypothesis. Sometimes you just go, it's inconclusive, and that's the end of my study. You don't always have to come up with this nice, perfectly wrapped bow. Because some things, for example, with the prompt, the researchers, we don't know why it works, but the research that the creators gave sucks, but it works. So what's happening there, right? So those are the things to think about when you're coming up with your problem and thesis statement to kind of put a nice little ending to your introduction. Questions? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, that is it from me. I'll pass you back to Dr. Jones now.
All right. Kara, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. I was here making some notes because what's a lot of what you said has relevance to the next presentation that I will be doing. And I hope at least the parties present here, if they don't have questions now, they were at least making notes, because a lot of this will inform the research as you move forward. You may think, oh, I don't need that right now. But later on, you may just have that epiphany, like, or that deja vu, I heard this before, where did I hear it? And you recognize, you go back to your notes and you recognize, and the notes will then remind you, will then trigger a memory to say, oh, this is where I remembered it from, and this was where it applied. So thank you very much for that presentation, Kiara. For my presentation, can you confirm that you're seeing my screen, please?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, now for my presentation, I want to have a discussion about the literature review. And this is an area that when I was doing my research, I was, do I need this? Because if I am going to be covering literature throughout my study, then why is it so important for me to have a section dedicated to the review of literature, right? And those are some of the things that we are going to talk about in this presentation. So the first order of business is to give a small overview of what we are going to be looking at. You know, we want to see, determine what a literature review is. We want to talk about its importance. Why is it needed? Now, we have decided that we do need it. Now, how do I go about structuring my literature review? And when you think you are done, let's look at that checklist and see if we have everything that we are supposed to have included. Yeah. So what is a literature review? Intuitively, we see it as a compilation and assessment of readings. If we're going with the intuitive definition, readings, sources that we're going to need to inform the study, to talk about studies that have been done before. So intuitively, it's a compilation of those sources and an assessment of them. But when you do a deeper dive, you're going to come to realize that the literature review is not just a compilation, or you classify it as a assessment, but it is a systematic. Everything has to be systematic. So it's a systematic examination of the scholarly literature about one's topic. It is supposed to help us to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize research findings. It's a place where you bring all the different theories, different practices, different techniques in one place, and you do an assessment of them. And that may say, but I'm done. I've done that. So my literature review is done. As we'll see later on, there are other elements that we need to include in our literature review. So one of the things you're going to come to realize is that when you look at a literature review, it is a hill and gully ride. It's you at one point in time, you find something that you think is very important to your study, and the next piece of literature that you consult then throws that all off. The importance to remember is that when you're writing a literature review, you're creating a literature review, it's a knowledge building exercise. that is supposed to help you to guide researchers on their own contribution to the pool of content that already exists out there. So yes, you want to look at what exists, but to what end? This is because what the information that you are consulting with as you go through this in terms of creating this literature review is supposed to help you to say, okay, this already exists. So when I do my study, this is what I am going to be contributing to, because I don't want to have an over saturation of this particular topic in the field, or to ask, as Kiara mentioned, to ask a question that somebody else asked. So you're going to have moments when you think your literature review is going well because you find the literature that contributes and supports your own idea moving forward. And then you come across a literature that just breaks that spirit. That is okay, because remember, the literature review is not to support your idea. It's supposed to be introducing you to what already exists. Yeah, so it's a knowledge building exercise. A few things I want you to note, however, about the literature review. It is not just a summary that you typically find in an annotated bibliography. A lot of persons, when you have a conversation with students and they say, okay, I'm doing my literature review and this is what I have found. So what do I do with information? Do I just simply summarize it? And, oh, I saw this literature review. I consulted this literature review in putting mine together. And what I have found is that all they did was to summarize. No. A literature review is not a summary of sources typically found in annotated bibliography. A literature review should connect the dots. So while it summarizes and it presents some information about what already exists, that's not done. You have to now connect the dots between each literature that you have consulted to create a narrative about how it is applicable to your study. So one of the things that I want you to take away, if nothing at all, from this presentation is that when you are through with your literature review, what you have is a narrative that links all the pieces of literature that you have consulted, state what each says, and then you are connecting the dot between all of those pieces of literature to say, based on what already exists, this is where my study fits. So it helps to ground your literature review, helps to ground your study. All right. So it is not a summary. The intent should never be to select literature that supports the direction that you are trying to foster in your study. So it's just like when we are working with a hypothesis, we think, as Kiara mentioned, it's some form of intuition that we have, and we are basically putting this in a statement to say this is what is going to exist. It's somewhat of a prediction. Now, when we make predictions, just like as we exist outside of our own space, our own academic space, in our normal lives, we don't like to be wrong. So we think in finding in our hypothesis being disproven, our study has failed. No, a hypothesis, the disproving of your hypothesis is a finding in and of itself. So don't get down on yourself because it was disproven. So in that sense, do not select literature that supports what you are trying to achieve in your study. It is supposed to be objective, right? Now, you are now supposed to present all perspectives. You have to present all positions. You have to look at all the different approaches, all the different theories. It's a consideration of all of these, taking the key points out. Now, after the narrative within the literature review should aim to present a renewed outlook. So sometimes we may say there's an over saturation of this type of research elsewhere, but it's a question that has never been asked within the region. So for example, within the Caribbean, we have never asked that question. So now I have to, I am going to ask this question of the region. The thing about that is you don't want to, because it has never been asked before, you think you can present it the same way it was presented elsewhere. Now, your literature review is supposed to present you with a different way of presenting what has already been presented elsewhere in a new or a novel environment. All right. So why is it that a literature review is needed in the first place? Why do we need it? The literature review is needed to inform the researcher. Sometimes we like to sit in our corners and just write. And that is okay. And we may be writing and we are going along and we find, oh, this is interesting. I bet nobody thought of this before. And you keep on, you are on a high. But then you didn't consult any literature. So you didn't know that not only that idea that you said is novel, not only is it not, but it's there, that statement has been made in several different environments before. So what your literature review is supposed to do is supposed to inform you of what already is known about the topic. But what it does in doing that, it helps you to identify areas now in which the knowledge is needed. So if it is done here, where is it? Where does my study fit? Right. So it helps to design your current study. Your literature review is needed, as I mentioned earlier, to avoid overlaps, and it avoids you repeating the studies that have been done before. Since it not only focuses on what areas are oversaturated, but also on what is covered in these areas. All right. What are the findings that came out of these studies? Now, in reviewing the literature, the writer gets to present a comprehensive and critical and must be accurate understanding of the current state of the knowledge that already exists. And what that will do is it will reveal gaps in the literature. And those gaps are now what your study is supposed to help to fill, right? So if you don't know the gaps because you don't know what exists, you have not consulted any literature, then you don't know what the purpose of your study is. And this is one of the reasons why Kiara asked earlier, you have to justify your study. In your justification, this study is needed, and I know this because I consulted literature that already that presented what already exists, right? So some other purposes of the literature review, and in this area, one of the things that I want to point out is you may have there are different areas that contribute to what type of literature you are going to be looking at. So you may have consulted literature and all is well in the introduction, but the methodology that you're going to be using is not, it has never been used in this study of a study of this kind. So now you need to consult the literature to justify your methodology. So you have different purposes. So some of the purposes to clarify and define terms and key concepts used in the context of your study. This is highlighted, this is in red because sometimes we like to define, we create a list of definitions, but those list of that list exists outside of a context. So if you can define the terms and key concepts when they are needed, then you don't need them in your literature review. You don't need a literature to dedicate an entire literature review to definitions. There's context for it. It situates a topic within the historical background of the research area. It places the topic within a contemporary, so it presents a history, but it also, and in that history, you have to come full circle to where it is up to the point of which your study is going to be done. It sets up a theoretical framework. Now, this is also highlighted because your theoretical framework may be extremely important, so you have to dedicate an entire section or subsection to it. And if that is the case, the literature that is expected will be covered in that conceptualization, not necessarily in your literature review. It is supposed to recognize influential and seminal studies that have shaped your field and discipline. And sometimes your supervisor may say to you, "Oh, but you need to have you consulted any work from John Brown?" And you say, "No, why?" "Oh, no, you need to know about John Brown." Actually, what you need to know about is John Brown's work, the importance the importance of it, and the novelty at that point that it brought to the area at that instance. Now, if you know about the seminal work, you're going to know about the author. You are supposed to know about the author. The flip side is not necessarily guaranteed. So this is one of the reasons when you are reviewing what John Brown said, not John Brown himself. All right. States how how your research revises, extends, or refines the understanding and knowledge of the topic. It demonstrates how your research is linked to the studies. As I said, connecting the dots. It helps to do that. A literature review can identify and critique methodological and research techniques, and it helps to justify what is going to be employed in the current study, especially if it's nuanced, right? It justifies the significance of your investigation by establishing the importance of the issue you are researching. Most importantly, the literature review is supposed to, every single piece of literature review is supposed to identify gaps. Gaps that exist, some of which your study is going to is hoping to close. All right? Not everything. You think, okay, so I see five gaps. Only 2 may be able to be covered in your study, So just choose those 2 and work with them. Don't try to cover everything, right? So how do you structure your literature review? One of the first things I'll say to you is to determine what is needed in your literature review. It is going to be, you are going to have to focus on your introduction, for example, to cover the scope of the study. Once you identify the scope of the study, then the intermediary parts are going to start jumping out at you. And once you find those, then you can lay the foundation of the study. You're supposed to have some sub-classification of literature to be reviewed. And that may come in the form of subheadings. So yes, you can have subheadings in your literature review. And what informs that is like the research title, that keyword in the title, that is extremely important. Your research questions or hypotheses may inform the areas to be covered and your methodology as well. So the literature review, the literature examined in the literature review often differ from those that you will spread across a general write-up or the thesis. In the sense that what is focused in the literature review is specific to the general study. But then the other pieces of literature that you will include throughout the study is needed as a springboard for a particular point that is being made at that junction of the study. So you may ask yourself, what type of literature do I need to include in my literature review? If it is approaching only one point, then no, you don't need to. That will be covered at the point in time when you need it. If it has to be general and broad enough that you can expound and expand those points in your literature review. All right. So the literature review developmental process. So one of the very first things you have to do before you create your literature, you start looking at your literature, is to refine your topic. If you don't have one, then what are you researching? If it's not refined, how do you know the type of literature that you will need? So choose or refine your research topic. After that, then you can start finding your sources, locating the sources that are important to this research. Now, one of the things I will say to you is, at some point in time, your work, you may be doing study, focusing on a particular, examining a particular phenomenon that has never been studied before, and that is not what persons like to say, oh, this has never been studied before. So that is enough. No, it's not. Because it may not, this may be novel in the Caribbean, but it has been covered elsewhere. That is your starting point. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why the key points are important. The key points help you to find those critical elements that you need. So if it has never been covered in the Caribbean, but it has been done in all other areas, it has a global presence, just not in the Caribbean, then take some of the information from those critical and pieces of literature and use that as a starting point. And then you know the fact that it has never been done, right there, you're identifying a gap in your study. In the literature that already exists. So this has never been done in the Caribbean, though it has been done elsewhere. And this is what has been said about it in these areas. So the gap that is being identified now within the Caribbean is going to be satisfied within this study. Analyze and evaluate literature review sources. You have to look at the pros and cons, not just to summarize the key points. Look at what they said about these critical points. Analyze and evaluate it. Why? Because a narrative is needed. Remember I said earlier that your literature review is a narrative. So the narrative we are talking about here is what is going to be informed by your analysis and evaluation of what already exists. Organize now the thoughts and the key points that have been pulled from these different pieces of literature. Connect the dots, so synthesize them, and then build your argument that supports and grounds your study. Yeah. Now, the one thing that we often don't have in general research is that unique voice of the author. And one of the reasons we may do that is we don't see, sometimes we're just not comfortable to think that we are important to what is being, this is my first paper on this. It doesn't really matter. If you deem it important, then write it. But in writing it, you're going to have to develop your own voice. Your literature review is where usually one of those places that helps to develop that unique voice of the author, and you as a researcher. But you just have to stick to the writing conventions and the other conventions to ensure that you are not overstepping or you are not making any exaggerations. And edit. After you're done, edit your literature review, refine your narrative, and you are done. But before you say I am done, complete your checklist. So the first order of business is to say, okay, do I have all the relevant pieces of literature, possibly organized through subheadings? How is the evaluation of each piece of literature? Have I done that? And have I done that satisfactorily? Yeah. You extract points applicable to the current study. That is extremely important. And now, do I have a synthesized narrative that identifies the strengths and weaknesses of those studies, identifies a gap, and then state clearly what my study is going to be looking at and what elements of those gaps am I looking to complete. So all of those are now you are ticking off as you go along. Is your methodology unique? Then is there any literature in it that speaks to this? And have I grounded my study in the larger body of literature that already exists? Once you have done, I'm not saying that these are the only checkpoints, but these are the critical ones. And once you have these, you can say, okay, cool. My literature review should be effective to ground my study. Because I've look at all the studies that existed, I have critically analyzed them, I have identified the gaps, and I can move forward to know to explore those gaps that my study will be looking at. Yeah. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, in closing, the key points, the key thing to remember is your literature review is a narrative. It's not just a summary. Yeah. Now I will turn you over to Dr. Serena Chinian, who will be presenting on the methodology and those other areas now that you need to talk about when you need your data. Yeah. So thanks much for your attention. Dr. Chinian, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for this very clear presentation. It was very insightful. So I will build up on what my colleagues have already talked about. So I'm going to share my screen first. Everybody can see my screen?
Yes, seen it.
Okay, I'll try to put it in one screen. Okay. All right, so of course, Dr. Matthews talked about the introduction, how to do the introduction and so forth. And Dr. Jones talked about the lit review. And one of the questions as a research student you will be asking yourself is, what method should I use? What methodology should I use? Now, these are questions which may seem a little bit intimidating at first. You don't know what methods are about, what is methodology or methodology, what's the difference between the two. So we are going to have a quick look at the different methods and also the difference between the two terms. So I'll talk quickly about what is research. My colleagues already covered it, so it may overlap a little bit. So types of research, what are the types of research we can do? And sometimes you will also hear scholars saying methods and then methodology. So we'll make those two terms clear. What's the difference between the two? And we'll reach a sort of synthesis, like how to proceed from learning about the different methods and so forth. So what is research? It's organized because you have a certain structure, you have a plan to move forward. And it's also a systematic, empirical way of finding answers to questions. Now, as Dr. Matthews already pointed out, you may sometimes not find an answer to your question, right? But you are seeking answers and you may talk about the challenges you find and so forth, right? So you as a graduate student, you are a thinker in your own right. So you using your specific methods, your specific methodology, you will arrive at one specific answer, right? And of course, it's finding answers to questions. Now, questions are fundamental to research, right? This is how we reach our research topic. We ask ourselves questions about the topic. And so the questions contribute to your field of study, right? All right, so the research question. So some general guidelines, Dr. Jones already talked about it, so I will just quickly go through it. So it must not be too broad or general, otherwise you won't be able to reach a specific answer based on your question, right? And it's impossible to cover everything, right, on one particular topic. So it should not have been answered by previous question, or else you can also, as Dr. Jones said, you can do the same research, but with a variation. Like if it's an international study, you can base it on the Caribbean, or if it's already on the Caribbean, you can base it in Trinidad and Tobago. So you can also replicate the same study, but with variation, or else it could be a completely different area of study, as my two colleagues already pointed out, right? And of course, you have to have a question that needs to be answered. What are you really studying? What is my topic? And so on. So you need to define really what you're working on, right? And of course, it has to be a question that can be answered by empirical means, which is where your literature review comes in, right? You're basing yourself on what has already been written. How do you move forward from there? How can you be innovative and creative from henceforth? Now, there are different types of research depending upon your area of study. It could be a descriptive versus analytical. It could be applied versus fundamental. It could be quantitative versus qualitative. It could also be conceptual versus empirical. And of course, there are so many other types depending on your field of study. And as Dr. Jones also pointed out, you may come up with a whole different methodology, a new methodology based on your topic, your research, and the answers you are finding along the way, right? So we are going to look very briefly at each one, and of course, you will get more information online in books and so on. So what is a descriptive research? It's based on surveys, fact-finding inquiries. For instance, a descriptive research could be the state of affairs at the present, right? So analytical research would be you are using facts and information already available, and you make a critical evaluation of what you find, the information you find. So you also have applied research, which aims at finding a solution to an immediate problem facing a society or industry. So you're trying to find a solution to a problem. And of course, you have fundamental research, which is more concerned with generalization, formulation of a theory. And we move on to quantitative and qualitative, which probably many of you are using right now. So quantitative, as the word itself points out, is the measurement of quantity or amount. So usually you would use, this research is applicable to phenomena that can be expressed in terms of quantity. So here, usually you will be dealing with collecting of statistical data. And of course, it can be inferential, experimental, or simulation. A simulation, sorry, not stimulation. A simulation, because you can also create an environment. You can simulate an environment, and from there on, you collect data from the simulated environment and analyze that data. So these are also the possibilities, the subdivisions within the quantitative research. Now, qualitative concerns phenomena involving or relating to quality or kind. It's a little bit more subjective within inverted commas. For instance, you can be studying reasons for certain underlying human behavior, for instance. And you would, in that case, collect your own data, do interviews, and so on. So conceptual versus empirical. Now, conceptual research is used a lot in literature. So usually you would deal with an abstract idea, theory used by thinkers to develop new concepts or reinterpret existing ones. For instance, in literature, we could be talking about, you can analyze a text from a Marxist point of view, a feminist point of view, a post-structuralist point of view, historical materialist point of view. The possibilities are just endless, right? So that's why we need to have a methodology in order to make our research more specific, because it's not possible to just work on all those different perspectives. Once you have your methodology, it becomes clearer to you how to proceed with the rest of your research. Now, what is empirical? Empirical is based on experience or observation without due regard to system and theory. So in that case, you could be, you base yourself on what you have observed, data you have collected, and from there, you can proceed to form your own methodology, for instance, or use any other existing methodology. Now, there are also other types of research, lab research, you have simulation, you have clinical diagnostic, historical, and so forth, right? There are lots of other types of research, but I've tried to cover those which are the most commonly used. Now, as I said before, you will hear scholars talk about methods, methodologies, and methodology in singular. So what's the difference? Now, you can use methods or methodologies, which may be where the confusion may stem from. So methodologies in plural. So these two terms indicate specific steps or actions, phases, stepwise approaches to be taken in a certain order, right? It also involves like the different methods by which we conduct a survey, data collection, etc. So it could be, how do you go about collecting your data? How do you go about conducting your survey? So these would involve your methods or methodology. And of course, prior to your actual analysis, you will need to consider the best way to collect your data. So this is where methodology comes in, right? So methodology, you will see that it's derived from the Greek term metahodos, meaning the way along, right? So it also means a system of methods and principles for doing something. Now note that this is singular, it's one system, right? You may have a lot of methods, a lot of research techniques and so on, but then you will proceed by choosing one, right? Which would be your methodology. So that would be a logical order to follow in order to achieve a certain predetermined result. That could be knowledge, insight, design, intervention, and change, right? So you will follow out of all those methods. For instance, you're doing interviews, you're collecting data, you have different sets of data collection. So these would be your methods, but out of all those methods, you would choose the logical order, that is the methodology, the specific methodology you would use to continue. So defining and defending this logic of the logical order is what methodology is about. Now, you will have to, at some point in your research, say, okay, I have chosen this particular methodology because of whatever reason. So you will also have to justify the methodology you have chosen. You need to define it and also defend it. For instance, in literature, if I am analyzing from a post-colonial perspective or a decolonial perspective, I would define what it is I'm talking about and also define the methodology I'm using. Why am I using, for instance, post-colonialism to analyze my particular topic, right? And we've all heard of the saying, all the roads lead to Rome, right? It's a very common saying. And in a certain way, all the methods will lead you to getting one particular methodology, right? Right. So many scholars talk about the research pyramid, right? So we will start at the bottom. You would see research techniques, research methods, research methodology, and finally the research paradigm. So we are going to talk about each one and see how from research techniques you can move to the research methods, and from there on to methodology and to your specific research paradigm, right? So here we won't start one, but from number 4, right? So what are research techniques? These are the practical instruments or tools for generating, collecting, and analyzing data. What are the techniques you are using? And from there on, you would move on to methods. What are the specific steps of action that need to be executed in a certain order, right? You have lots of techniques of, for instance, collecting data, right? But what methods are you using, right, for your specific research? And from number 3, we move to 2, methodology. Methodology would be one way or a way to conduct your research that is tailored to your research paradigm, right? And of course, the paradigm is how the researcher views reality, this topic, and what is its basic approach. And of course, you would have to, as I said before, define that methodology, right? So this book is quite helpful for those of you doing quantitative or qualitative analysis. Nicholas Williman, Research Methods. So I could put it in the chat for you. And of course, the takeaway from my presentation is doubt. It's very normal to feel doubtful. You would be asking yourself, am I on the right path? Maybe I'm wrong. Should I use another method? What methodology? It's all a normal part of the process. If you are in doubt, this means you are on the right road, right? Because that leads us to asking ourselves more questions, and the more questions we ask ourselves, the easier it becomes to be inquiring more about the topic. And of course, that will lead us to an answer or a non-answer concerning our topic. So that's all for me. Thank you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chinien. I know our presentations, well, I didn't allow any time towards the end of my presentation for questions. So the floor is open for not just questions from mine, but Dr. Chinien's and Dr. Matthews as well. Questions, comments? We have a hand. Paula?
Hi, Byron and Sabrina, thank you very much for that presentation. It's very enlightening, actually. I just had a question about one specific point from Byron's presentation. I think it's your second slide, no, third slide or fourth. When you gave the 3 points of things to consider when you are doing the lit review.
Yes.
You say the intent should never be to select literature that supports the direction being fostered in the study. Do you mind expanding a little bit on that one? Because I don't quite understand what you mean by that.
Okay. So when you are compiling the literature, part of it is that you are going to have to do a quick scan of it, or you may read through it in its entirety to determine its importance or its relevance to the pool of literature that you're going to be covering. Now, as I said, we like to hear things that support the direction we're heading in. So we may just find we came across seven pieces of literature that spoke to gender as an important concept to sociolinguistic studies, something random. And based on the fact that you had a hypothesis that said gender is extremely important. However, of the 7 that you have, only 5 agree with you. So you decide 5 is enough. I'm good with that. And you do away with the other 2. That's my math is right. So yes, good. When you look at it from that point of view, it's not to just disregard those that aren't leaning towards your direction. You also need to explore those. You have to now do an assessment of those other 2 to say this is what they presented. And however, this might not be something that is applicable within my context. So for example, remember I said the research may be novel to your era only, but does not bring a global novelty. In that sense, when you explore what is said in South America, well, in North America, what is said in parts of Asia, the statements made disprove your hypothesis. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need to include them, analyze them, evaluate them, and say that the context of the Caribbean, for example, is unique, which then presents your hypothesis being disproven. This comes up, this is important, not just for your literature review or the concept of your literature review, but it now, 1, creates a gap it creates a basis that needs to be explored. So later on, it has relevance for your findings and conclusion. So all those areas are extremely important. So when I said don't just select those that are important to yours or support yours, your literature review requires an exploration of everything. What is out there? What is out there is not just what supports your point or goes along with what you are thinking. There are going to be disagreements. Those need to be covered as well, and then you break those down. Does that answer your question, Paula?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thanks much. And thanks for the question. Dr. Chinin, you had something to say here?
Yeah, yes, thanks, Dr. Jones. Just quickly to add to what Dr. Jones said, Paula, it's also about not being biased. Like, like I'll take a very lighthearted topic, like, is KFC healthy? It could be that you love KFC, right? You really love it, and you will find studies that support, yes, it's healthy, right? But you need to be really unbiased. You have to consider both sides objectively in a very empirical manner, collect data on both sides, and then finally reach a conclusion. So sometimes we are not aware even of it, but we are sort of biased because we already are prone to having an idea even before starting to work on a topic, which is where the danger is, because you need to be empirical at all times.
Definitely. And that's it right there. The research, and this is one of the reasons I said all the areas presented here today are connected in one way or another. And you don't want to create a bias by only exploring pieces of literature that are important to your study, because a bias in your literature review is going to be recognized as a bias of your study, because sometimes that bias comes through from your introduction, it moves through your literature review, your methodology. Wow, I like this method. Forget about what anybody has said, I am using it. And it continues to know when you reach the point where your voice is needed, your discussion of findings. You think that bias stops there? No, that is where you are going. This is now your opportunity to speak. And once you start with that voice of bias, that permeates through the entire research. And that is what is automatically going to be recognized. That's going to be the standout quality of your research. Oh, this is a biased view. And a biased view is often either disregarded or highly scrutinized. Karen?
Yeah, and just to go off what Byron just said, and just because it's a published study doesn't mean that author wasn't biased, right? Like, when I was doing mine, I started with like 70 something studies, and then it was like, nope. And I just kept like, oh, wow. So the same risk that we as researchers run being biased, the researchers who eventually get their stuff published and it's like, oh, this is great. They could also be biased as well. Which is why, when you go through these studies, like the introduction might say something, the literature review might say something, and then in your review of the methodology, you go, no, that doesn't correspond to what you were trying to tell me before. And then somehow the results match their hypothesis, even though the methodology does not make those things coherent. So it's very important to look out for your own biases, but also to look out for the biases of the literature that you're reviewing.
Definitely. Kara just mentioned it might be anecdotal, but it's extremely important, is having a high volume of literature. Nobody says you have to use all of them. And as you saw, it's about narrowing that pot. You are going to, now you may ask yourself, but how do I determine? That is why we said your introduction, you need to have a semblance of an introduction before you get to your literature review. Because within the introduction, you're creating the scope of your study. And it's the scope of the study that will help to guide what type of literature you include in your literature review, the type of methodologies that you use. Because as much as you want to include everything, you are working with a timeline. And one study shouldn't be the end all be all of research in a particular area. Nobody's saying that your study needs to stop all pieces of research. It is supposed, your study is supposed to then also act as a platform for next piece of study. It is supposed to be a springboard for further research. The idea about this, though, is your scope of your study is important. The scope of your study informs your methodology. It informs your literature review. One of the things that you may also find in your literature review is particular analytic tools or methods of analysis, especially if it is either novel to this discipline. Because what will then happen is you want to see you're covering the literature on this particular analytic technique or analytic tool to say this is how it has been used in other areas. Novel here, but has relevance in other areas. And this is what I am planning to use in using it in my study, which is a novel space. These are the takeaways that existed in the previous studies that I'm going to be using in my study. And in doing that, what you're doing is actually justifying the use of this particular technique or tool when you use it in your analysis. And the way you collect your data, your methodologies that are used are also going to have relevance for that particular tool. So if you listen to when you listen to Dr. Matthew's presentation, one of the things that should jump out is your introduction. When you complete your introduction, initially, don't think that is going to be your introduction that you end your study with, because there's a lot of tentative statements made in your introduction. There are a lot of tentative statements made in your methodology. You may even need to go back and add to your literature review. So we think, all right, I'm done with my introduction. What next do I need to write? Or my literature review? Okay, cool. Spend your time, you expand your timeline, you're through. All right, you can breathe a sigh of relief, your literature review is done. You go through your methodology. This is how I plan to, this is the type of data I need. These are the steps. I'm done there. Discussion of fine analysis. But then you may tend to realize when you are at your findings and conclusion, you may need to go back based on the statements made that you know identify as your critical findings of your study. Some form of adjustment needs to be made to then balance the study. So there are a lot of things that you may take away from the presentations here today. But one of the things that you should also remember is that these individual pieces, these individual presentations are used as a whole in your thesis. So they need to flow. There needs to be a flow. And the statements you made, and that's why I spoke about your writing voice. Finding your writing voice is extremely important, because then have you ever come across a piece of literature that you know it's important, but just how it's written creates a barrier to the content of it? That's the importance of your writing style. How your style, how the voice in your writing is supposed to help to make the content more digestible. Yeah. Do we have any more comments, questions? we are here to take them.
I wanted to ask, so as Kiara would have mentioned, we have an assignment due today. What I encountered, and I believe Sabrina may have touched on it, is the type of research question that I came up with. And, you know, after looking over and everything, I would have seen that there are so many different types of research questions. What I'd like to ask, is there like a type of research question I should avoid? Because somehow I felt like my type of research question had me feeling a little bit insecure, because I feel like I didn't get enough information to complete the assignment at its optimal, you know? So that's why I was asking, is there types of questions you should avoid in your thesis?
So I'll start by saying yes, we not just in a thesis, but in research in general. It's about the structure, because remember, your research question, each research question that you ask must be answered. So in essence, your research question must be one that is not a yes or no question. Or it must be expandable. So if you ask a question, if you ask a what is question, you should be asking that question with just some intuition of what needs to be answered and what is needed to answer it, but you shouldn't be able to answer it right there and then. Because if I can make a simple statement about a question, then why do I need to do research to answer this question when I have the answer right here? The question is almost conclusive. So why do I need to? So those type of questions, it must be researchable. It must be expandable, but also it must be able to shape how you analyze. It's supposed to be able to shape your analysis, for example. It must also, so sometimes we find pieces of research that have 5 research questions. Sometimes less is better. So the fewer questions help to ground your study, help to create a scope for your study, because the scope of your study is not just in one statement. The scope of your study is permeates through the entire research. So how you ask your questions, how the background is shaped, what you include in your introduction, all of these are supposed to guide. So your research questions I think it's more important to ask, to point to the type of research questions that you want, the ones that bring some depth in their exploration. They provide a clearer understanding, they provide opportunity. The answer should have some implications for other areas. Because remember, research, if the research has no relevance in the wider society, why do it? So these are some of the things that you want to ensure that is clear. And once the scope is clear and the background is clear, the research questions will start to take shape. So it's about the entire process. Research is a process, and everything needs to flow. Hopefully that, okay, thanks. I hope that answered.
Just to add, and I'm only smiling because we have the conversation. And you know, as Dr. Jones would have said, you know, it's really about how you phrase or frame the question that you want to answer. So asking a how question can be simultaneously very specific and very vague. How does A affect B? Simple enough, but it could affect B in a morphological way, a historical way, a diagnostic way, a societal kind of something. So it's narrowing down the, like you would have said, the scope, because the scope is not just the people. The scope is also, as Dr. Chinian would have said, the methodology. Are you going to look at what lens are you looking at your question through? And sometimes when you get to the methodology and you realize what your specific methodology is, then you can revise your research question. How does X affect B in when it comes to semantic underpinnings? And that makes it more specific. Or how do clinicians' biases affect outcomes for B, right? So those types of things help refine the question. So I would say it's less what types of questions to avoid and more what details to include in the question to help you refine the question a little more, refine the study a little more.
That's it right there. I'm realizing how extensive the question that Kenisha asked is, because I'm thinking about as the simple thing of the type of Dr. Chinian spoke to the type of methodologies, and oftentimes the type of methodology that you use often inform the type of study. Now, think about a piece of study being done that requires lab work, for example. A lab work study is then supposed to be guided by the type of question. So, for example, if it is something that you are doing some experiments and the experiments are supposed to flow in a particular order, the question, one of the questions that may emerge from this type of study may speak to the sequential nature of the methodology itself. And in that sense, you are asking a question that is specific to not just to what you want to find, but to maintain the integrity of the discipline in which it is being carried out. So, for example, SLP is a clinical area. As a result, there are ethics to observe. There are particular processes that should be carried out before you say, I am done. And in that sense, the questions will may reflect that. Another thing is the type of study. Sometimes you may read a study and you realize the research questions are in the introduction. And then you consult our next piece of study and you find the research questions in the methodology and not in the okay, Robert, that wasn't for the record. When you look at where, you may ask yourself, but where is the right place? Sometimes there is no right place. It depends on how you are structuring your study. Sometimes, and this is now brings us back to the literature review. We have different types of literature reviews. We have standalone literature reviews that you are writing to do an analysis of the type of literature. It's like stock taking of the type of literature that exists and where we are. What was it? The last notable study in the field said X. So you can now say, okay, this person has done this type of study, and you're going to publish that for in a journal. So it's a literature review that is required for a journal, for example. But you may then have an embedded literature review, one that is going to be placed within a thesis, for example. That type of literature review is now the purpose should be seen by the purpose of the study should be visible in the literature review itself. So it's you connecting everything. So this is what they have for their assignments at standalone literature review. So in that sense, may not necessarily be to answer a particular question, but what you're doing is this. Let's do an inventory. What exists? That your inventory may then be a good starting point for someone else who is doing research in the area, because that standalone is basically a summary of what already exists. And it also presents you with information about different pieces of literature that you can consult. Once you consult those, okay, this has relevance for my study, I'll put it aside. Because don't think, one of the things that I will say is, when you have the literature for your entire study, have different folders in which you organize them. And you have the literature that is for your literature review. But even if you have a literature, a piece of literature that all you need from it is a critical point that you're going to use in your analysis, still put that in a folder, because what you're doing from there is structuring your bibliography, for example, your works cited list. And sometimes you may find, I know I need this point, but I can't remember where I got it. Now, I need it. But in needing the statement, you also need a reference. So you need to find it. So sometimes organization is important to any different area. You may find that in writing your introduction, you have literature for your introduction. In doing your literature review, some of those same pieces of literature may have relevance and find their way into your literature review. And then that element that was covered in literature, you may have some statements, a simple statement that has implication for your analysis of data. What you already have is the reference. So all of these areas are connected, and you are going to eventually realize that it's a process. That's why we classify research as a process. It's a process. And there are no shortcuts to a process. Sorry, there shouldn't be any shortcuts to a process, because there are shortcuts, and you recognize that shortcuts existed when the findings don't add up. And you said something in your introduction, your research question wasn't answered. So all of these are things that you have to focus on. Ariane?
Hi, morning. You can hear me, right?
Loud and clear.
Okay. I have two questions. The first one being, Byron, you were talking about the structure of the lit review, and you said something about the structure leading to the intermediary parts. Can you just clarify what you meant by that, please?
So I was saying that how you determine what type of sources, for example, you need, and how you structure your literature review, the type of subheadings you need, or the different points that you need to focus on, are informed. That is informed by your intermediary parts. And the intermediary parts I was referring to were like your research questions. Your research questions may have a keyword in it, and that keyword needs to be expanded. Because, for example, language attitude. If we're thinking about language attitude, there's a lot to say about language attitude within the Caribbean. So in your literature review, especially if it's in your topic, for example, if language attitudes emerges as a critical point in your topic, then it has implications that permeate throughout the entire study. Then you may need a subsection under your literature review for language attitudes. But that need was informed by an intermediary piece, which is your topic. and possibly your research question. So that's what I meant by in the intermediate pieces. The different elements that are important to the overall study may inform the types of literature that you need. Does that help, Aaron?
Yes, thank you. I understand. My second question was for Dr. Matthews. So I'm currently working on a project and I'm having an issue distinguishing between exactly what should be in the introduction and what should be in the background to this study. Because the more that I write in the introduction, I keep telling myself, no, this should be in the background. And then the more that I write in the background, I tell myself, no, this should be in the introduction instead. So I keep going back and forth. And I feel like at this point, I have a lot of overlapping statements. I feel like I've basically said the same thing multiple times. So how can I really distinguish between what goes where?
I would say there isn't really a distinction sometimes. Sometimes you might find yourself having to repeat yourself. Whether it is a matter of making, for lack of a better phrasing, introductory statement in your introduction, so A, the end, and then in the background of your study, you elaborate on what you meant higher up. So you might find some redundancies. Particularly, you might find redundancies throughout your entire study, but there isn't always that clear distinction, which is why in many studies, the background of the study is the first part of your introduction, right? So do you mind giving an example? Maybe I can help a bit.
So I'm basically looking at some language change. I guess it's kind of diachronic. Yeah. So I was trying to do a general introduction, talking about some of the changes and things that might motivate the changes in the particular language.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to expand on that in the background to the study, give, a more complete look at what those different linguistic inputs would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that you basically answered yourself. So in the introduction, if you have a separate introductory paragraph, you would say something along the lines of, these are the particular changes that have been observed or that you are looking into, and these are the outcomes, and you very general, simple statements. And then in the background of these studies where you list the particular things that you would have noticed to classify or to clarify what those changes are. Simple as that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
In adding to what Kara said as well, Ariane, also remember that your background is also included in your introduction. So think about it as, and forgive me for the analogy, but it might be one of the only ways I can explain it. Sometimes you have a pot in the sink that you need to wash, and you eat some food, and the pot has space for a bowl that you just ate from, and you ate some ice cream, and then you put that sauce, that small container inside that bowl. Now, where do you put the soap to wash all of that? In the first container. Now, you have to do something to get the soap everywhere, because the sink in which everything is your entire research, and the different containers inside that sink are different parts. For example, you might want to classify them as your introduction, different parts of the introduction. So for example, the plate, for example, may be the background. And you may take that saucer that you ate the ice cream out of and put it to the side because it's smaller. And that may be the section where you justification is part of your introduction. The background is part of your introduction. So it's in the introduction. The introduction serves to present an opening piece, everything that you think you need to say, this is what I am doing. Okay, that's answer your question. Okay, I can move on to the literature review. These are the pieces of literature, but I need data. This study needs a process, methodology. I have the data. I can't answer my questions, which was part of the introduction or possibly part of your methodology. I can't answer these questions without doing some exploration. So the analysis is important. That is where now I have my analysis, I have my conclusions. I need to do something to define them, to make them definitive within this entire study. Your discussion of findings or findings and conclusions. So it's about thinking about the background serves, as Kiara said, to now say, all right, within the context of whatever I am exploring, this is what is existing, and this is what I need. And your background now, also remember, it's part of your introduction. So then you create that segue for the significance of the study, because your background is supposed to inform the significance, because the significance says, here's why my research is important. But how do you know that this is important? You just covered it in the background, though. So all of these are interconnected.
It is also a sort of stepping stone, or like a sort of trampoline. Like the background would be, I would say, stepping stone or a trampoline to go further. This is what, as Dr. Jones said, this is what exists, and this is what I'm planning to do from what I read, from the background, right?
We have time. Jaffer?
Yes. Hi. Good morning. Okay, just Clark, you can hear me, right? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So, Byron, you touched briefly on the importance of finding your writing voice.
Yes.
And you said that in some instances, the voice of the writer can create a sort of barrier or create difficulty in terms of how the reader is able to interact with the actual content or the study itself, right? And for me, as an undergrad student, I find that subject or that task very intimidating, finding your writing voice. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit, touch a bit more on that. So like, what is that process, or was that process like for you all, or
Very good question. Thanks for that, Jaffer. And what I can do is make it anecdotal in a sense, so that I can give my opinion. Dr. Chinian can give hers, and Dr. Matthews can give hers. Finding your writing voice is supposed to be intimidating. Sometimes we want to skip that part where it just appears. No, it's a process. You have to find it, and finding it, it's one of the things you have to remember is your study is important. It is, never mind you need to prove that. I agree, Kenisha. It's hard, but you also have to remember that there's relevance and importance for your study. And sometimes you walk to the supermarket and you go down the aisle and you look at that section of the aisle where you want milk, for example. There's this specific milk based on the price that hardly anybody touches. But you know that everybody wants it. When you go down that aisle, today you have money to buy that milk. So you walk with a certain set of confidence. That confidence comes from the fact that you know the importance, you know that this study is warranted. That is part of where the background comes from. That's where the significance comes from. So what is expected there and then is not to be overconfident in your voice, but also still find the way that you command some sense of authority. Sometimes it comes from their wording, the choice of words that you use. And this is one of the reasons why some disciplines will tell you to stay away from personal pronouns in your study, because the thing about it is, even that in and of itself is a subjective thought, because there may be some parts of your study where you need to say I. And even if you don't want to reference I, the researcher, which obviously everybody know who the person is, saw XYZ. So sometimes it's writing in a manner that you can be, that it must be clear and understandable. That's your voice. Clarity is an important characteristic of your voice. You must write to be understood. Sometimes we find that to say, to have a phrase that expresses your thought is less effective than a single word itself. If you can find that word, sometimes the word doesn't cover. So you might have to include that particular phrase. So for example, you're doing research on fire hazards, for example. And you can say, you know that word, extinguish the blaze, and it works well. But sometimes the scope of what you're writing needs for you to say, put out the fire. You don't, so it's keeping it simple, understandable, but also making it clear that I did my research so I can make these statements. So the intimidation is going to exist. That's what causes anxiety, you know. Anxiety causes gray hairs. One of the things that causes gray hair. But the reality is, when you look at what you're doing, you are supposed to be confident that whatever I am doing has a place. How do you know that there's a place? You covered it in the justification in your introduction. You had it in your background. You had it in your literature review. So it is needed. Once you say it is needed, now you also need to have the information to answer the questions. That's why your methodology is so important. It's a process. I took the necessary steps to avoid bias. I was very ethical in collecting my data. XYZ, I'm checking all those boxes. Now I have the information to say whatever is important to add to the field. But before you can do that, you need to have a very solid analysis, one that explores all the grooves. It takes everything into consideration. That is what gives you the robustness to your study. So your analysis is heavy, as it should be, because it comes with depth. It looks at all the corners. Now, once you do your analysis, the key findings from your analysis is what is going to be found in your discussion on your findings and conclusion. And that is where your voice is more definitive. You know, so it's basically to ensure that, one, you are not overconfident, but you are very clear and confident in the statements that are being made, because the research is there. That is why the research process is a process. You are proving that the findings can be trusted. Think about it. You remember some of the we can start, if you're thinking about it from a medical standpoint. If you are supposed to trust whatever this medicine is supposed to do, then it needs to go through a trial, and the trial is the proving ground. And then once that proving ground is conclusive, the information that comes out of that proving ground, then I can say this is supposed to solve your headache. Never mind, there are side effects, XYZ, but I know that it will solve your headache. You know, so again, it's about doing the research. Part of that intimidation, Jafia, will start to wear off. And it wears off, and you find your voice once you move along, because once you have completed different steps of the process. That's my contribution. Dr. Chin and Dr. Matthews.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I think anybody doing research would start with doubt. We all have doubt. We all find it intimidating at the beginning. I don't think there is anybody who would say, okay, yes, I have my writing voice. I know what I'm going about. The whole purpose of research is to find an answer to whatever question you have. So obviously doing the research, and the thing with research is that the more research you do, sometimes you find you are going to question what original views you had. You're going sometimes to change your research question in the first place, right? You may start, Dr. Byron said, he mentioned previously, you can start with one question, but then you may end up with something totally different based on your literature review. Right?
Mhm.
That's why I ended my presentation saying that is an integral part of research. All of it, I mean, even me writing a book or writing an essay or a chapter, I mean, I question myself, okay, am I using the right methodology? Why am I using that methodology? How am I contributing to all the existing literature already there? I think these are questions from which, you know, you will start from, and that is part of the process, right? And it's also with habit. I mean, the more you do it, the more you write, the more presentation you make, it becomes easier as you go along, right? It becomes easier, but it's, as Dr. Byron said, it's a process. You need to do the research. I remember just a quick, a personal experience when I was doing the defense of my thesis. I had 9 members of jury, and the defense went on for over 4 hours because everybody so it was very long. But there was one particular member of jury who didn't agree with what I was saying, and I said, no, based on this and this particular finding, I do not agree with what you're saying, because the research is there to back it up, which is what Dr. Jones says as well. Once you've done the research, you become an expert in your field. And sometimes even your member of jury may not know that particular point that you have research on. They may know it, the broad topic, but that particular area you research on, you become an expert on it for the simple reason it's years of research you've done. Like you've been systematically doing 3 years of research. So you become an expert in that particular field. And once you have that, you will start gaining confidence about, okay, I have research to back me up, so I can define my point of view, right? So this is where research is very important, and you have to be very systematic, very organized in accumulating the data behind. Once you have that to back you up, and it will be easier for you to find your own voice, easier for you to be writing in your own style, and to define, most importantly, your point of view, right? But believe me, that and, doubting is part of the process. And actually, I would say that is very good, because once you doubt, it will lead you actually to finding answers to the questions you've been asking yourself. If you don't doubt, this means there's probably nothing to look for, right? So it's part of the process, and I think everybody feels it, right? But once you do the research, it becomes easier as you go along, right? Okay, Dr. Matthews?
Yeah. I will give some insight to what my process is like. A lot of people disagree with my process, okay? But it works for me, and that's how I know it's my voice. So when I go through the research, I like to number the articles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 50. And then I write how my brain, so train of thought, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, article 1. So I'm not even writing the citation 1, and I continue writing and I plug in those numbers. That way, I am not letting the academia of the research influence my own thinking about the research. And then I would plug in whatever quotes or table or whatever I need to put into that spot, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 15. Then I go over the process. Does this sound like academic research, Kiara, because you'll hear how I talk. I know. So then I revised what my supervisors, Kiara, you can't write sucks. I'm just like, but it sucks. You need to change that word. Those types of things. And that's how I started my process. And that was kind of a kind of reverse engineered kind of thing. Because even in grading some of my students' assignments, as anonymous as they might be, when they submit it with just their student ID, I can tell this is how this person writes, this is how this person writes, this is how this person writes, because it's such these particular students have let their voices come out. I think a lot of the times what I've found, particularly when I'm doing undergrad thesis supervision, we need to sound like researchers. Yes, but you are a researcher. You don't need to sound like every other researcher out there. So when I see citation after citation after citation after citation, that's great. Where are you in there? Like where's Jafia? Where's Ariane? Like, I'm seeing what all these other people are saying, but what are you saying about it? So for me, I prefer to read all the research first, make it make sense to me. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but make it make sense to me, and then put my thoughts down. How do my thoughts align with the research that's out there already? Have I completely understood the methodology that I say I'm going to use? The gap that I'm seeing is there, is it actually there? So then I kind of do a mapping of what my brain generates versus what the research says, and then I put those two together. It takes long, but it works for me, I find. So, find the process that works for you. Some people do it the other way around. Some people, they need to write down all the academic things first and then think their way through it. Some people, like, okay, if I do the research about the methodology first, does that help me think wider about the rest of the study? And then they go back towards their lit review. I think when it gets to the discussion and the analysis, that's where you get to shine a lot. And, it's heartbreaking to see how many students rely on other people's thoughts for their own discussion. Like, no, this is your study. Like, what did you see? How do you feel about what you did? So there's so many different ways to insert yourself into what you've done. And over time, like both Dr. Chinian and Dr. Boone said, over time, it takes time. The first one will probably not be great. The second one will probably also suck. But, the more you do it, and even within an assignment, within a study, your first draft is just that, the first one. I have so many folks, draft 1, draft 2, draft 25. And you just keep going until it sounds and it feels like you. Because sometimes it's an assignment and you're just trying to get your grade, submit it, do that. But a lot of, so I and my students know, you get graded for how much it sounds like you. Like, how do you think? And they get the comments, what do you think about it? I know Broker and all these people think these things already. What do you think? So there are different ways to go about it. So it's just what makes you, how you feel most comfortable going about it.
Thank you so much.
That helped me. So that's brilliant. It's important to find your voice, and your voice may be not just in how you write, but your thinking, your thought on paper, your innovations. Be free to innovate. If you want to pull from, if you read two theories, the two lead theories in an area, and they make no sense to you, do your own thing. It starts somewhere. It's not going to be a conclusive theory because it came up out of one piece of research, but it has to start somewhere. So your voice comes from different places, and that's what you just heard right here. So thanks for your question, Jaffer. Do we have any more? We have 5 minutes remaining in our session for today. Do we have any more questions? Dominic says, I'm glad that was said because everyone I mentioned my proposed topic to always have it. You see, that Dominic also comes from the fact that sometimes the response is because they don't understand your research, and that's okay. Where do you make them start? Where do you make them understand it? It starts with with your introduction, and everything that you do throughout is supposed to get them to understand. And once they understand, because remember, you know, sometimes what you're doing is explaining your topic in passing. The thoughts that require clarity may not come at that point in time. So you make your notes, you write down, you start your process, you do what you have to do. And then the next time you see that person, it might just be a matter of, this is what I'm looking at. And sometimes you may not even, it's at the beginning of the study, you may not know what you are studying. You think you know, but you may not. And it's until you carry out that research, you realize, oh, that wasn't actually what I was looking at. Kara mentioned that. And it's through going back and forth, where you actually find the correct words, the correct the phenomenon under study. That's when you find it, because it's a process. But don't feel bad about what people have to say. Once your literature and your research tells you that there's a need for this, put some clarity to it, have the data to support it, analyze the data, make your statements, and you're good to go.
People always have things to say, but to trust, right? Whether they disagree with whatever your topic is about, you have to trust the process and trust the research you are doing, right?
Definitely. The one thing that adds to that is when we talk about the grounding of your study, the relevance of it outside of this discipline. Who is your audience? Why should they care about what you're researching? Once you find the audience and you find the key points that you need, and you find everything to convince them, you don't need to tell them anything. Once they read it, it's there. So finding the place where your study fits. That's why they always ask you for these different theoretical frameworks that ground the study. Am I using a constructionist approach? Why is it that I'm using this approach? It's because you have already done the work to say that based on the audience and based on everything else that surrounds what I've researched, this is the one that works best with what my intentions are and the type of data that I have. 1 minute before we wrap up. We are good. I'm hoping that you are a lot more comfortable than you entered the room today. I do hope so. So thanks to my colleagues and Robert in the background who made this possible. So thanks for your attendance, and stay glued to whatever channel you found out about this series, this phase of the research process, because we want to provide an avenue for you to bounce your ideas off us. So we may have something else based on our debriefing for you. So stay glued to that, and thank you very much for showing up. Been a good audience. Thanks much.